Thanks to Headamp for sponsoring this review. Headamp are the makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic headphone amplifier, as well as the Gilmore series of amps, including the new GSX Mini. They also sell the Odyssey LCD5, as well as some of the other products in this review. Not long ago, the Focal Utopias were my favourite headphones. I bought them after I borrowed a pair from a friend to review them, and I was so impressed by the detail retrieval from them that I decided to find a second-hand pair myself. And so here they are. And also, since we had the LCD5s in for review, just like I did with Hi-Fi and Sasvaras, I decided to compare them with the Utopias, especially since a patron of mine asked about my impressions of the LCD5s being a kind of ultimate HD6XX, and he has the HD6XX and the Utopias, so I thought I'd do a comparison review. Now, for this comparison review, I've done a couple of things. My original Utopias had the original old cable, which is not the current one that's being shipped with Utopias. So for the purposes of comparison, I put the same kind of cable on both headphones, and that is a Norn Silverguard. And I happen to have both already, so that worked out very well. So some people, get very triggered about the mention of cables, and sorry if you were. And some people are like, oh no, what your impressions are different if you change the cable on the headphones, you can improve this facet of them or that kind of thing. Rather than go into that, I just thought I'd use the same cable. Now for amplification, I mainly used this Chord TT to an M scaler stack along with the Luxman P750U that I borrowed from Stefan, who you may remember from the audiophile or the non-audiophile videos where I got him to try out a bunch of high-end headphones. So with that aside, of course I have some other things like the Headamp GSX Mini and the ALO Audio Studio 6 in there, but essentially for all intents and purposes the results were much the same, with some subtle differences between whether the slightly warmer Studio 6 versus the sharper sounding, say, Chord TT2. But anyway, let's get on to the fine details. Now, a bit of an overview of the design. The Utopias are, well, they're aging just a tad. They're not the newest kind of design, and they are very well built, but in my pair are getting maybe just a touch creaky, and maybe the pads are wearing a slight bit, but they are still very comfortable and very nice to wear for long periods of time. The Odyssey LCD 5s have, the latest headband design, a little bit less comfortable due to the kind of concave shaped pads which put more pressure in a kind of a ring around your ear. Although they are much less heavier than the regular Odyssey headphones, they are still extremely well built using magnesium and steel and carbon fiber, whereas the Utopias, of course, are mostly plastic and carbon fiber, with some metal in there as well. Now, of course, both are fantastically made headphones. I'd say the LCD5 has the edge there with nicer materials. But aside from that, let's get into the main thing which you're curious about is how do they compare. So I'm going to give an example of a few different tracks, but one of the main things that comes across is the Utopias are known for having a narrower soundstage, but one that I feel that, especially say with the Chord gear that can reproduce soundstage depth very clearly, produces a very deep soundstage. Now, if you EQ the Utopias, say if you use some software to make them pseudo-flat sounding, that soundstage depth disappears and they just become more left and right. Really interesting thing how frequency response kind of affects that, and I believe it affects phase as well. So that kind of thing is maybe one of the reasons that the Utopias sound deeper is because of their tendency towards having a bass light signature with an upper mid presence. And that we're going to see actually affected my impression of listening to a variety of music. The Odyssey LCD 5s, on the other hand, are tuned, well, we're going to call that flat, like speaker flat, where we have no emphasis, or overemphasis, I should say, on any particular frequency range. Though for all intents and purposes, that, at least to me, comes across as sounding more mid-forward. And given some measurement and analysis, maybe it is a touch mid-forward around the 3 kilohertz, kind of 4 kilohertz range, which is not my preferred sound signature, but other people may like as well. I also, just for my ears, find that the treble to be a touch low, and some other people haven't found this at all, but up in the kind of from the mids through to the treble, people's hearing varies most considerably, so that's just maybe, it could just be me, probably is just me, and other people will find it a little bit different. So let's get on with the music comparisons. So, glancing at my notes, my first track that I decided to write about was Emmylou Harris, Going Back to Harlan. And this is an interesting track. It is very clearly through the LCD5s recorded, it'd been a mixed together from different components. The vocals are probably recorded with Emmylou Harris singing in one of those kind of boxes, or rooms with padding on the wall, and the guitars likewise both sound like they're mono, whereas the other parts of the music track seem to be mixed in as if they were recorded in a separate studio, maybe at the same time, but in a separate time, we don't know. But it's very clear from the LCD5s that this comes through. So the vocals and the guitar, which seem to be mono, are kind of very in your head, whereas everything else that's kind of recorded in a more spacious surround or mixed to sound spacious sounds much more around and outside your head. So there's a very clear soundstage coming through there. So the vocals and the guitar are pushed forward quite intensively, and that's one of the things I found with the LCD5s, is the vocals and mid-range are a little bit too forward for my preferences, but people who really love that, I felt, in things like the HD6XX, will really like the LCD5s in my opinion. Or even if the sound tuning is maybe just a touch different, with maybe a touch less treble and a touch more bass, but that improves other things that it may not be considered with the HD6XX. Now the Utopias, on the other hand, were a surprise, as I actually haven't listened to them for a while. They had the vocals further back, which was kind of a surprise with that upper mid presence, and the music comes through kind of more delicately, so with maybe slightly less intensity than from the LCD5s. And especially with less bass intensity, which was something a little bit of a surprise, as I kind of consider the LCD5s a touch bass light for preference. I didn't realize how much more bass light the Utopias were. So that focus on the upper mid-range and treble really comes through with the Utopias, and this is why a lot of people change the ear pads on them to kind of change the sound signature, or especially use them as I do, with a big tube amp or something that's warmer sounding to balance them, or simply to EQ. So the soundstage, as with I mentioned before, sounds narrower with the Utopias and deeper. So on to another one. I'll just call this track Fiesta, and I'll put the name in the description and on screen, because if I try and pronounce Spanish, I'll probably muck it. But it's by Mark Ribot, who, if you've watched many of my reviews, you'll see I really like Mark Ribot's playing, and is very good for very high quality music and good for testing kind of the presentation, the timbre of instruments. So again, with the Utopias, which, I just switched tracks and I kept the Utopias on, we have a focus on the higher frequencies of the guitar and the percussion, which bring them out really sharply, and I'd say too much so, if anything. Now, at that point, they seem to almost overwhelm the sound. The lighter bass seems to mean that this over-focus on the upper mid-range is maybe too much. What's really pleasant is the way the bass seems to kind of float out. It doesn't have so much impact in that track, but it comes through in a kind of more floaty way, rather like you get from Electrostats, which can be pleasant in its own way, but it still feels distinct and sharp in that regard. Now, when I switched to the LCD5s, I found that there was noticed there was more precision in the subtleties, the subtle nuances of each note, like with a guitar pluck, the sounds of the decay, and if you have percussion, like the subtleties of each hit, or if of a shaker, how the contents of the shaker are moving around. That kind of thing really came through from the LCD5s, whereas the Focal Utopias tended to focus more on the macro, on the bigger sounds in general. So for example, there are some smaller hand drums on that particular track, and the thing with the Utopias is I found that they didn't come through quite as cleanly as they did with the LCD5s. And the LCD5s, I noticed that that particular part of the percussion came through more cleanly than it did with the Utopias. The Utopias tended to have that issue you get with, say, headphones and IEMs, where there's a slight phase issue, where the percussion doesn't come through as cleanly and clearly sounding, like it doesn't sound quite as like percussion is. Whereas the LCD5s, I could more clearly make out that, yes, that was actually a drum. I mean, you noticed it in both, but it was more clear with the LCD5s. The only thing, of course, as I said with the LCD5s, for my ears, have the cymbals just a touch muted for preference, although other people may find them just right. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If I was just listening with the LCD5s, I probably wouldn't notice that. So the bass in the LCD5s too feels more present, which again was something of a surprise. And with that less overemphasis on the guitars, that meant that the kind of presentation was more even-handed than the Utopias, which kind of over-focused on the upper mid-range and made the track more uncomfortable to listen through. So I felt that, rather than the floaty bass of the Utopias, the LCD5s was more kind of impactful and precise in that regard, even if it isn't like overemphasized or super strong, like you get from a lot of other headphones. The next track, Muddy Waters, and well, pretty much any track on Folk Singer. Now, Folk Singer is a very high quality album. Sometimes you'll probably hear me talk about dynamics, and that means, the difference between quieter sounds and sudden, louder sounds. And Muddy Waters goes from singing quieter to a mid-range, suddenly with jumping out with big notes. And it's very, very noticeable on this album, which was digitized using a gain system that was designed by Mike Moffat, who is now of Shit Audio. So there's a bit of an interesting history to this one. I recommend those recordings that were recorded on the gain system, check those out. A lot of them are fantastic. And you really notice this in, for example, when you're going from, say, one of the mid-range, amps such as the SA1 or SGA1, up to something like the GSX Mini. You'll notice that there's, with this kind of track, that the difference between the dynamics between the lesser amp and the greater amp, even though these, the GSX Mini costs 4 times as much, with this kind of album, you really notice that. And that was very helpful in noticing the subtleties, especially between both headphones. So with the LCD5s, the vocals came through with delicious precision. I mean, there's so much to hear on this track, and the subtleties and dynamics of Muddy Waters were just fantastic. And as well, the guitar also was just great in this kind of echoey space that he's singing in. Now, the LCD5s managed to bring out everything from the macro, the big dynamics, the big sounds, through to the micro sounds, the nuances and the subtleties of the music, just beautifully with these tracks. However, the Utopias, immediately I noticed switching over that a lot of the micro details just seem not to be there. And we're talking, still very high-end headphones, but compared to the Utopias, the LCD5, just more of the music came through. And it was really a surprise because of how much more detail I felt the Utopias had originally when I upgraded from Sennheiser's HD800s. But I also noticed that when I went from the Utopias to, say, Stax's SR009S, is that I felt that the Stax just had more of what I liked about the Utopias, but more nuance and more detail that came out. So it seems the LCD5s are inching closer to that kind of perfect ideal for me, where you can hear all the way into the track, into the fine details, and combined with the ability to keep, even in very busy passages and even very complex music, keep the details of each instrument through clearly, just like with that Mark Ribot, where some of the drums had been slightly maybe muted by the Utopias, and the LCD5s had that ability to kind of bring out those drums, even though they're kind of in the background. That was what was really great about them. So for me, I don't do like winners and losers. It tends to be, some people like this and some people like that. But for me, with these Utopias, well, these are saying goodbye. Actually, I'm selling them to someone because I just don't listen with them anymore, and I feel they've been superseded by other headphones such as the D8000 Pro and now the LCD5s. So as always, if you're looking to buy high-end headphones, I hope this video helped you. If you're looking for my buying advice, don't forget you can become a patron and ask me questions anytime you like, for as long as you're a patron, and I'll happily help you out where I'm able to. Don't forget to check my FAQ that I did to make sure, before you ask questions to me, if I actually have the gear that you're asking about. And of course, thank you to everyone who has been supporting me as it's made these videos possible. So also don't forget to check out my site here.audio, and thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.